Hello, you're watching the development vlog for Shokin, a multi-platform waitlist management tool soon to be available on Android and iOS. This is week 50 of development. The current status is that the Android alpha version is ready and available for testing on the Play Store. However, the iOS TestFlight is not yet ready. This is the current focus of development, and last week the task was to complete iOS TestFlight onboarding, but I didn't manage to finish that. It turned out to be a bit more complicated than I originally anticipated. Ran into two issues. The first issue is a GitHub macOS runner issue, and the second issue is the iOS TestFlight policy issue. So with regards to the first issue, as I mentioned last week, to build any iOS app, you have to use a macOS operating system, macOS device, in other words. And in order to have that accomplished in my GitHub Actions automatic CI/CD deployment pipeline, I have to add a macOS runner to test and then build my iOS app, and then have it automatically deployed to iOS TestFlight. Now, to be clear, this is done, but it took longer than anticipated. One of the things of macOS runners on GitHub Actions is that it consumes 10 times as many credits as a Linux runner. In other words, my free 2,000 minute credit was burnt in 4 or 5 builds, because every build is about 30 to 35, maybe even 40 minutes. And at some point, I ran into the issue of GitHub Actions not building, because I was testing my GitHub Actions pipeline, and it just wasn't building. And I noticed that I ran out of my minutes. What this triggered was my intention to bring this build process offline. In other words, instead of building using GitHub Actions runners, I would use my self-hosted runners. During that deployment, ran into a couple of other issues. So the first situation is that you're really not supposed to do this, but I am doing this. I'm running it on my personal machine. And one of the reasons you're not supposed to do that is because it essentially if you have a GitHub Actions runner on your self-hosted machine, that machine essentially executes any code that's being sent by GitHub Actions. In other words, that's a attack vector. And the best practice is to make sure that you secure the device and make sure that you only run it with a trusted repo. And currently it's fine, right? I'm the only person who's committing to this repo and having all control of everything. But in production, you're supposed to be more security minded than what I'm currently doing. That said, anyways, that wasn't actually the problem. I wasn't trying to lock it down, and that wasn't where I ran into the issue. The issue where I ran into was that when you're using GitHub Actions on GitHub, using GitHub runners, all the environments that they spin up for your actions are ephemeral, right? They come, they give you a clean environment, and then you do your thing, and then they go out. And the next time you do it, it's the same clean environment. You can expect consistency. When you're doing GitHub Actions runner on your personal device, you cannot expect that consistency. Now, again, there's a better way of doing this, which is actually spinning up a Docker environment and then cleanse it, do your stuff in it, and then bring it down and then remove all the ephemeral data. I didn't do that. That's way too much effort. So if you're running it just locally in your personal environment, you have to make sure you clean the environment first, do your thing, and then clean your environment before you exit. So I ran into this, I wasn't thinking this, I ran into the situation where my first run was great, successful, and then started having issues because there's a lot of stale build files that caused issues, file lock errors, and stuff like that. So it took a little bit of diagnostics to figure out what the problems are, and then put in the correct clean instructions at the beginning of the GitHub Actions to make it work. To be clear, later down the line, when I transition back to GitHub Actions and actually start paying for the minutes, I wouldn't have to change my GitHub Actions, because those extra cleaning steps that I put in ought to work regardless of the environment. In any case, this problem is fixed, and I also moved, well, currently I moved all the GitHub actions onto my self-hosted GitHub runners, because I don't have any minutes at this point until the end of the month, and I have to keep developing. In other words, I have to be able to use the GitHub actions. So all the actions are now running on self-hosted GitHub runners. When it goes into production at some point, I'm going to move them back up and start paying the cloud credits to run them. But at this point, thankfully, I have a solution. I don't have to worry about every time when I push it to remote that running the tests as well as the build verifications would take up so much of my minutes, and running out of the minutes before the end of the month. So that was the challenge number one, the macOS runner expensiveness causing a string of issues that I had to deal with. The second issue I ran into was the iOS TestFlight policy issue. So this is actually not very clear. I tried to find information online as well as written policy, and I also asked AI about this to summarize legal documents for me. It's just not very consistent, and I think that's the name of the game. So to be clear, when you upload any app to iOS, same with Android, by the way, the app has to be approved, reviewed and approved. And for production apps, the review and approval process can be onerous. And I understand that. I haven't gotten there yet. On Google Play Store, if you're doing alpha testing, internal testing and alpha testing, the review was very lax. From my experience, it's been automated. So every time when I push an app to APK to the Play Store, the review process would take no more than 5 to 15 minutes, which suggests to me that it was automated. In other words, there was not a human manual reviewer doing it that would take like over a day. With TestFlight, on the other hand, my understanding is that's different. They're more stringent. And currently, I actually need to fill out all the metadata information as well as the store listing information, all the pictures, screenshots, icons, descriptions, and all of those things, which I've been using sort of a placeholder version of those things on Google Play Store. It was not a problem, but my understanding is that iOS TestFlight has I suppose, a higher level of standard. You actually need to put some effort into making those things. So I need to get those done. And the biggest issue that I think I discovered is that my app requires a login. It has to, right? And one of the things that I discovered, one of the most common rejection reasons from iOS is that if you have a login-free app, you must offer Apple login. And I have not implemented that. My code at this point is completely platform agnostic. In other words, there's really not a lot of platform-specific code in my repo. I want to keep it as centralized as possible and to maintain one, code base. With Apple Login, on the other hand, if they force me to do that, I will have no choice but to implement it on iOS platform specifically. In other words, this would be extra code that I'd have to write in an environment that I'm not as comfortable with, just to make this login work so that I can be approved for App Store distribution for TestFlight. In other words, for alpha or for internal. So my plan at this moment, because at this point we still don't know. There's not, again, like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this report, there does not seem to be a consistent situation with regards to whether or not this is required for TestFlight. So my plan is to actually do the store listing and everything, and actually put in a proper logo and get proper screenshots and make it all look very nice and stuff. I'm going to just submit it and see if it gets approved. If it comes back with this rejection reason, then, they forced my hand that I'd have to implement Apple login. In which case, I probably will do Android login, Google login as well for Android as well as Apple. Because one of the reasons, there's another reason that I really don't want to implement Apple login, which is the Apple login gives you options to obscure your identity as a user, your email address and stuff like that, which is fine. I mean, I understand people's, I guess, preference for privacy. But for this particular app, which is focused more on the business side of things, in other words, you're a business owner, you're a restaurant owner, and then you want to use the waitlist management app, you would sign up. The privacy situation is not as important in a way because I would imagine most of them will want to actually have a transparent relationship with me. And that's the first thing. So in other words, it provide the email obscurity, or the hide my email part of it has less value to my target audience. That's number one. And number two, it creates additional administrative overhead for somebody like me. Like, imagine if somebody submits a support ticket and I'll be like, what's your email address? And I can't find your email address in my database. How am I supposed to help you? Or how am I supposed, and then I have to independently verify the person's identity, as well as later down the line, when and if I introduce paid options, linking those two things together would be, it's just a lot of headache. So that's another reason why I don't want to use Apple sign-in. The obscure my email part of it, I think, gives me a lot of headache and anxiety at this point. But then again, if they require it, I would have no option but to implement this. So it is what it is. And you can't ignore the iOS market, because iOS seems to be much more, apparently folks on iOS are much more willing to spend money on apps. And for something that I want to maintain long-term, revenue is an important consideration factor. But that's my rant for this week. So in summary, last week I didn't finish the onboarding for iOS TestFlight. Explained the two reasons. Reason number one, the macOS runners, very expensive. Had to come up with the self-hosted runner situation on my own devices. Ran into a couple of issues with those during implementation. They're fixed. They're ready. They're now automating every day. The second problem I ran into was the iOS TestFlight policy uncertainty. And the goal for next week is to fill out the marketing metadata information for my app, submit it without implementing Apple login, and see if it gets approved, at the very least for alpha testing. That's it for this week. I'll see you next week.